A gunshot sounds as a former state trooper sits at his kitchen table one night. He rushes around, searching for the source. Soon, he comes upon a scene he says he's feared for some time. Investigators arrive and have several questions, namely, who could have wanted a middle-aged woman with seemingly no enemies dead? And how did her killer even get inside the house? My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Idaho in winter can be an extreme climate. The third largest city in northern Idaho, Lewiston, sits just on the Washington state border. Up by the Hells Canyon Grand Hotel in town, the Snake and Clearwater rivers meet at what's called the confluence. When I was in town investigating a serial killer case over 10 years ago, the hills surrounding this area reminded me of the rolling, near-perfect green hills in Teletubby land. I could have stood in some spots staring out into what is one of the most gorgeous countrysides in the United States for hours, taking it all in. On February 2nd, 2021, former Idaho State Trooper Daniel Howard is downstairs in his home doing domestic tasks, signing paperwork and going through his bills. In his mid-50s, Dan is a handsome guy with a dark-colored, bushy goatee, receding hairline, and dark eyes. Tall and fit, Dan is a former Marine who continued his public service work post-military with the Idaho State Police. As Dan is downstairs and he and his wife Kendall's Othel, Idaho home on that February 2nd night, he says a gunshot startles him. So much so, he jumps out of his chair and immediately begins searching for the source of the shot. Kendall is a sweet and beautiful woman, dark brown hair with blonde highlights flowing down past her shoulders. She wears trendy glasses with the big lenses and black frames. Kendall was 22 when she married Dan, 6 years older. By 2021, the marriage is nearly 26 years old. That's a long time. And some of those closest to the Howards say they have a strong, solid union. With one son together, also a Marine, Kendall and Dan seem to be enjoying a quiet life on 10 acres of land in a town with just over 700 residents. Othel is a straight 2.5-hour shot north of Lewiston. The town butts up against the Idaho Panhandle National Forest, just an incredible area of the state, woods and hills as far as the eye can see. Being such a small town, when things happen in Othel, it's a safe bet one of your neighbors has heard about it. Working hard all their lives, Kendall and Dan have amassed what reports claim is over $2 million in property and additional assets. Dan's run as an Idaho State Trooper ended on a tragic note, which wound up causing some problems for Dan and Kendall within the marriage. Back in 2011, after arriving at the scene of an accident, the man driving the Jeep involved in the crash began backing up directly in the line of then-Trooper Dan Howard. Both the man driving and his wife in the passenger seat were fugitives. Dan orders them to stop, but the Jeep keeps coming at him, and so he fires 6 rounds, one of which hit the woman and kills her. The case was sent to the local prosecutor after the driver of the Jeep said he never saw the trooper and was simply trying to flee the scene of an accident. Dan refuses to speak with investigators after giving his original statement. The case is sent to prosecutors, who later clear Dan and do not ultimately charge him. That incident, however, drives a wedge in between Dan and Kendall's marriage. Family members say Kendall became severely depressed afterwards. 2 years after Dan kills the woman, he ends up leaving the job. Looking for work, Dan winds up in Alaska 3 weeks at a time, then back home for 3 weeks, working in the oil fields. Of course, Kendall and Dan begin to grow apart because they were never together, and Dan also seems to be becoming angrier as time moves on. He also begins to demand that they not spend any money. And so when he did come back home during those 3-week intervals, he and Kendall fight. Kendall even begins telling family that she no longer loves Dan. All of it comes to a head one night. Dan arrives home from a trip at the end of January 2021. "I need to talk to you," Kendall says. Dan sits down. It sounds very serious. "I've seen a divorce attorney," Kendall says. "I've started the process of buying a house, and I am moving out." Dan just isn't the same man she had married and fell in love with. He had grown quiet and bitter and aggressive and cheap. They were not the same people. Kendall has dreams, goals. Dan is no longer part of her life plans, and Dan feels rejected. Kendall grew up in Lewiston. She had taken to track in school and was, by all accounts, a very girly girl. As a child, she had an affinity for rodeos, loved horses, and loved to ride. She had a daughter when she was out of high school before she met Dan. And Kendall loved nothing more than helping the kids, be it the 4-H club or in any other capacity where she believed it mattered. On that night, Kendall breaks news of wanting a divorce. She expects a reaction from Dan. After all, she is leaving the house. But he seems to take it well, or at least she believes as much. Kendall is hell-bent on reinventing her life and starting fresh. She's young, attractive, plenty of money, in great shape. Her kids are grown. She's even a grandmother. Life can begin any time we decide to do it. Kendall is well aware of this, and it appears that Dan will accept the changes and they can both move on. A few days later, after that divorce conversation, on February 2nd, as Dan is sitting downstairs doing the household bills and signing paperwork and begins looking for the source of that gunshot I mentioned at the top of the episode, he says later he figures out that it came from upstairs, inside the house. He goes to see what happened. In the bathtub, he says, he sees Kendall, the water around her a light-colored hue of red. Kendall's pistol is in the water next to her body. She shot herself in the head, Dan tells first responders. Detectives show up near midnight after first responders report that it's a likely suicide. Kendall had succumbed to the pressure, according to Dan. They were just starting the process of divorce. The first thing that stands out to detectives is that Kendall is nude, in the bathtub, as if she is taking a bath. These types of suicides are generally hasty, not ritualistic. In other words, the victims in these situations don't necessarily light candles, grab a towel, run the bath, and then settle into the water and put a gun to their heads. They get into the tub, fully dressed, and they get the job done. Another big red flag for investigators is that Dan, sitting now in the kitchen, waiting to answer questions, took a shower before they arrived. He'd also changed clothes and applied body spray. Strange things to do when your wife of almost 3 decades is upstairs, dead in the bathtub. Then they look in the laundry room. A bath towel and bath mat are in the dryer, and the dryer is running. At midnight. Dan, one detective says, You know it's standard practice here that we need to test your hands for gunshot residue, right? As soon as those words come out of the detective's mouth, Dan sticks his hands into his pockets and begins twisting them around. Dan, you need to stop that. Stop that right now, please, the detectives tell him. The impression we got, that detective later tells CBS, is that he is trying to wipe something off his hands. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. I'm doing this show independently now, free from any corporate or big podcasting media company involvement, which allows me to bring you more of the content you want to hear and have asked me for. This is completely our show. Reviews and subscriptions really help. You are my public relations and social media team now, and without your help, I could not do this. And that support, I must tell you, means everything. It's incredibly humbling. And I want to thank each one of you for listening. We can grow this show together, which will allow me to do even bigger things with it. If you go to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com, you can contact me there to suggest cases or just say hello. And look for me across all social media platforms at M. William Phelps. That's the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. That gunshot residue test detectives wound up doing after Dan took his hands out of his pockets comes back negative. Yet they are suspicious, especially after speaking with family, many of whom explained that Kendall loved life. She would have never left her kids in this way, nor her granddaughter. No way, not a chance. She had plans. She had just met with a divorce attorney. She's just joined a spin class. She'd even made an appointment to get plastic surgery. She was looking for a new house, moving out. Those are not behaviors by someone planning to leave the world. Things seem to change when detectives speak with a neighbor, someone Kendall knew well and had been close to. She told me she doesn't deserve to be here, the neighbor says. That might indicate she was planning to kill herself. Details and small bits of information can be the most compelling pieces of evidence for investigators. Early on, they are focused on searching for any minor mistakes a killer might make and overlook. I think it's obvious that the only question in this case is manner of death. Suicide or homicide? If it's homicide, it's clear who committed this crime. I love this piece of investigation right here. One of the detectives calls the manufacturer of the washing machine they found running on that night of Kendall's death at the Howard's house. He then goes online and checks out the times for the cycles on that specific machine the Howards own. With that information, he matches it up against when Dan Howard calls 911 to report that he had found Kendall dead upstairs from a self-inflicted gunshot. Checking the machine again at the house, the detective learns that the machine was started within 1 minute after Dan makes the 911 call. Who does that? Dan is also acting sketchy and seems rehearsed whenever he speaks with investigators. As a detective, you get a feel for this type of body language, and a person, no matter how hard they try, cannot hide who they are for extended periods of time. The news story Dan tells is that they had a fight that night. Kendall took out her weapon, put it to her head, and then she dropped the gun, and a shot went off through the floor. Then she calmed down and went upstairs to take a bath. And that's when Dan says, I heard a loud thud on the floor above my head as I signed some paperwork in the kitchen. Another piece of this is from a body cam one of the cops on scene was wearing. In that body cam footage, Dan is shouting to someone he's talking to on the phone. It's Kendall's daughter. It's clear from the conversation that the daughter accuses Dan of killing her mother. And the detective there, hearing this, asks Dan why she would say such a thing. The accusation was so loud, the detective could hear it from across the room. And when he confronts Dan about this, Dan says, kids don't want to believe their moms would do that. I got to tell you, Dan, that phone call puts chills down my spine, the detective says to him. Dan doesn't respond right away. So the detective puts it out there. You did this, Dan, didn't you? No, he says. Well, I think you did. Dan says he is done answering questions. Investigators begin to dig into the case as if Dan Howard committed the murder. They know he did it. But there is zero forensic evidence left behind at the scene, which they attribute to Dan being a cop for so long and knowing how to stage a scene. After more digging, a secondary motive pops up. Apparently, in 2013, Dan confronted a neighbor, a good friend of his, alleging that the neighbor and Kendall were having an affair. In a rage, Dan shows up at the guy's office one day after the confrontation and tells him, quote, I'll splatter your brains all over these walls. For the next 4 months, Dan harasses the guy relentlessly. Dan is arrested, convicted. He spends 4 months in jail. He's still a trooper at the time, until he is forced to resign. When Dan got out of jail, things were never the same. Always angry, he began manhandling Kendall, grabbing her by the neck, causing bruises all over her body. Kendall documented all of it and sent those photos to her good friend for safekeeping. Days before her death, Kendall had called the police and they went over to the house. She'd picked Dan up at the airport and they began fighting. This was actually the moment when she broke the news to him that she was done. It was over. The argument ended and Kendall went to sleep. At one point during the night, she wakes up and Dan is standing at the foot of the bed staring at her. He is calm, quiet, dressed in all black, wearing black latex gloves, and get this, he's got a pillow in his hands. Kendall leaves the house, but she returns a day later, and 3 days after that, she's dead. You know, I am a firm believer in that when somebody shows you who they are, not only should we believe them, but we need to take steps to be rid of them from our lives. Kendall Howard is in the process of doing just that as those days pass before she is murdered. She's doing everything right. She's got a plan. She's taking the steps she needs to get herself away from a guy who is growing increasingly more unstable and even violent as time passes. When the autopsy results come in, the pathologist rules that Kendall died from a gunshot wound to her head. There's not much else they can say about her death. It seems Dan has covered his tracks. The prosecutor and the investigators, however, are unsatisfied with that report. So they bring in a forensic pathologist. And I loved that they did this. Took the case a step further out of sheer guts and knowledge of crime scenes, driving them to see this until the end, or at least until they are satisfied they have done everything they can. So detectives head down to discuss what has been found by this new forensic pathologist. For one, Kendall's body has lacerations and bruises all over the place. And look at this, the pathologist says as they walk over to the X-ray machine. Kendall's jaw is broken. Now, One could say that because she is found with a gunshot wound to the head from placing the barrel in her mouth, like in many suicides, that her jaw could have somehow been broken by the impact. That could make sense. It could be argued during an imminent murder trial. But detectives are told something even more shocking. That gunshot wound to her head, it did not kill her. Investigators look at each other. The pathologist says Kendall was already dead when the gunshot wound was fired into her head. I'll be right back. I cannot stress this point enough, and I want to just refer back to my limited series running right now, 34 Fairview Road, focused on the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe and the prosecution of his girlfriend, Karen Reed. Murder is not complicated from the point of view of the investigator. Generally, most of the time, the obvious answer is the answer. These seasoned detectives show up at this scene and immediately get the feeling that Kendall Howard did not kill herself, that she was murdered and that her husband did it. That is not putting blinders on or focusing on a guy because you have a hankering to bust his chops or close a case. Further talking to that new pathologist, her opinion is that Kendall had been strangled to death before being shot in the mouth and placed in the bathtub. During this time, they also learned that Dan was kind of known among other troopers as the guy who had taught them a particular restraining technique for the job called carotid restraint. Killers always give themselves away if you stay on them long enough and keep digging. When you look at a case and it just speaks to you in a way that you cannot turn away from, you have to trust your ability to find the truth. By April 2023, prosecutors have enough circumstantial evidence to charge Dan with murder. He is arrested a few miles from the airport, which made it clear to authorities that he was fixing to get the hell out of Dodge. Dan's trial lasts 10 days. In late May 2024, the jury, after 8 hours of deliberations, comes back with a guilty verdict on second-degree murder. Over 60 witnesses testified, many painting Dan as a monster, a man who pushed his wife around, controlled her, and when he felt he had lost that control, well, he killed her. The judge says, "What we know beyond a reasonable doubt is that you strangled your wife. You murdered her, and then you staged her naked body in the bathtub, shot her through the mouth, and tried to pass this off as a suicide. You killed a mother. You killed a grandmother. You killed a sister. You snuffed that out because of your own pride, greed, and anger." Then the judge sentences 58-year-old Dan Howard.
Sometimes the nature and gravity of the offense standing alone is sufficient to justify a fixed life sentence. And that is what I'm going to impose here. I think Kendy's family deserves to have that closure. The crime is so egregious that I don't think you should be released at any point in the future. And I don't impose that lightly. I have thought long and hard about this, considered all the evidence, considered aggravation and mitigation. There's just so little mitigation here. There's just really none.
Not much more I can add to that. The judge gave Dan life. appropriately noting that the guy is a time bomb, and if he ever got out, he'd likely commit more violence. I like that, Judge. They do get it right. That's it. Until next week. I need your help. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget, leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. And log on to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com to contact me and suggest cases, or just say hi. And look for me across all social media platforms using the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. Thank you for supporting this show. I am allowed to do it because of you, and that truly means more to me than I can say. Remember, be safe, be aware. Sources for this episode include trial transcripts, police reports, trial video, and several news articles, which I noted in the text. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinas, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.